think you can see by the absence of any sparkling twinkling here that this is going to be a decidedly low-tech presentation. There's no PowerPoint, no pictures. This is an exercise in the oral tradition. There's a long-standing joke among we anthropologists, and actually my favorite anthropologist, Dick Bergner, is right here in the front row, and he can verify this. There's a long-standing joke in anthropology that the older we get, the more we take on the habits and the customs of the people that we study. And for me, that means an ever-increasing appreciation for African oral tradition. Those long, convoluted stories with cryptic references and lots of digressions and polysemic symbols and metaphors and metonyms and multiple meanings, and then push the whole thing off to the audience and make them decode the narrative and tease out any relevant meaning, if indeed there is any. This format seems appropriate for my presentation because it's actually about the oral tradition of African studies in the U.S. Now, I recognize that this talk need not necessarily have been about the oral tradition because, in fact, there's been an awful lot written about African studies. In fact, almost every 10 years, there's a major outpouring of work that attempts to sum up the discipline, assess its challenges, examine its history, speculate, or even prophesy about the future of African studies. Just to mention a few written works, most of you elders here will remember Bates, Mudimbi, and Obar, Africa and the Disciplines, back in 1993. Our own distinguished Africanist Jane Geyer, I saw her here earlier, in 1996 produced a volume entitled African Studies in the United States. Our past president, one of our past presidents, Paul Zaleza, has written often and elegantly about the history of African studies. Another past president, Joseph Miller, likewise, just a few years ago, back in 2007, produced a volume entitled Life Begins at 50. African Studies Enters the Age of Awareness. And again, some of you senior scholars might remember Larry Bowman, at Connecticut at the time, produced a massive volume, the National Survey of African Studies Faculties. And this is back in 2002. I'm going to return to that particular volume because I think a lot of it is still relevant for what I want to talk about today. But anyhow, there are some wonderful works out there, written works about the history of African studies, insightful, stimulating, innovative, and in some cases quite provocative. The problem, I would assert, is that they simply are not widely read enough, and they're particularly not read by our students. Hence, I think the oral tradition remains particularly powerful. It's those bits and pieces of African studies history that periodically flow through the hallways of our respective institutions, the fragmented memories of our senior scholars that seem to pop out spontaneously, brief digressions perhaps in your weekly seminar. These are what people tend to remember and carry forward as the history of African studies. Rarely do we senior scholars assign the readings that I have noted above, or otherwise insist that our graduate students seriously study the history of the African studies enterprise. My own graduate work in anthropology at a rather famous East Coast institution, those of us who were focused on Africa, not only were we not taught the history of area studies, we were indeed told, stay away from area studies. We are anthropologists. We are grand theoreticians of the human condition everywhere. Don't get bogged down. Don't get bogged down and stay in one place, we were told. As soon as you have a reasonable understanding of the basics of social life in one place, move on. Do comparative work. Break new ground. Area studies, you're just stuck defending the same old turf. So, as I began to reflect some time ago on the African Studies Association bylaws, and I see with all of our numerous presidents, you'll remember Roman numeral 5, section 4.6. It dictates that the outgoing president must give a lecture on the state of African studies. Quote, the state of African studies. This produced a dilemma for me. because both my intellectual and my personal voyage through life has made it clear that there are many African studies, or at least there are many different manifestations of African studies, or many facets of African studies. So when we say African studies, what exactly are we talking about? Are we talking about forms of institutional arrangements? Or are we talking about sets of individuals whose interest and intellectual production happens to be centered on a particular continent? Or are we talking about this ever-evolving set of paradigms, perspectives, and methodological approaches that seem best suited for handling the messiness of African politics and economics? Or are we talking about transformative social movements? Or are we talking about something else altogether? Hence, before we can say, well, African studies is here, or African studies is moving there, it seems to me we need some clarity about which African studies story are we going to use as the base for our prognosis. Acknowledging, again, and frequently, that there are more African studies stories than I could possibly cover in this little short hour. In fact, there are more African studies stories than I could cover in a full semester course, so I have to make some choices. So I've chosen to focus on 2 big stories, 4 episodes. Or maybe it's just 2 angles on the same story at 4 points in time. We'll see. Like I promised, there will be some digressions. There will be some convolutedness. There will be some cryptic references. But rather than treating all of this as sort of shortcomings of a very disorganized mind, I'm going to present it as a challenge, as an opportunity, in fact, an opportunity for you younger scholars to engage with your seniors, to seek their assistance in filling in the gaps and helping to interpret the more cryptic portions of my presentation. The 2 stories that I'm going to present, they're not linear stories. There really are 2 streams that sometimes flow in their own separate directions. Sometimes these stories seem to flow parallel to one another. At times they even seem to actually merge and become one story, and then suddenly a turbulent eddy will pop up and one of the stories will break its banks and flow off in an entirely different direction. Anyhow, let's get started. Episode 1. As I said, I learned nothing about the history of area studies in my graduate program. That was left for my first appointment, Boston University, 1990, my first professional job. But included in that job was being assistant director of their African Studies program. As soon as I arrived, forces began to operate on me, began to socialize me, began to immerse me in the local lore of that place. We are the second oldest African Studies program in the country, having been founded in 1953. Only Northwestern, founded by the great Melville Herskovits himself, is older. I was impressed. I was humbled. The very thought of being the guardian, the caretaker, the inheritor of such a precious piece of American history was all a bit overwhelming to me. And quickly it became clear that this particular oral tradition was supported by all of the major African studies programs in the country. Wherever I went, whoever I talked to, people in Wisconsin, and Yale, Michigan State, Indiana, Illinois, they all agreed, yeah, Boston University, one of the oldest, most highly respected African studies programs in the country. It quickly became clear that this particular story was nested within a much larger story, a story about the Cold War, a story about the U.S. Empire, the Soviet Empire, vying for total domination of the earth, the sky, and even the moon at that time. African studies, like most area studies, is essentially a Cold War product. So this story goes. The 1950s, think back if you will, the 1950s, there were a few far-sighted individuals that recognized that the colonies of Europe, the colonies of Europe in Africa, the African colonies in the 1950s would soon turn into a flood of new independent nations in the 1960s. And that continuing to view them through the lens of a European imperial history would need to be replaced by new knowledge about local customs, habits, political propensities, resource-based trade, economics, social functioning, so on and so forth. A key moment, and I'll ask you to remember this, 1950, May 8, 1950, a key moment. The then Assistant Secretary of State, George C. McGee, gave a very famous speech. George C. McGee, a Texas oil man, a naval intelligence officer, a Rhodes Scholar, he gave a speech in which he talked about the need for America to gear up its relationship with Africa and its knowledge about Africa. In his speech, he noted, there's not a single comprehensive program of African studies at any American university. He begged the private sector, the private interests, particularly foundations, to help fill the void. He particularly pointed out the new effort at the Carnegie Foundation, the effort that it was giving to Northwestern, and he begged other foundations to do likewise. We need African Studies program. The Ford Foundation responded in 1954, and it gave Boston University $200,000 a year for 5 years to focus on developing courses on geography, peoples and cultures of Africa, economics, and to establish a research focus in Africa associated with urbanization, industrialization, and democratization. The elders, you remember this era of the Zations? Am I the only one? The Zations, when everything that was wrong with Africa could be cured by the Zations. So his Ford money is given to Boston University. It was free and flexible money. One could spend Ford money on anything, on faculty, graduate students, staff, field research, publications, library, documentation, visiting scholars, whatever. Wonderful money. IAI, the International African Institute, was given $50,000 a year to foster citizens exchange between the U.S. and South Africa. The University of Natal, again, this is American private foundations giving money, in this case even to African institutions. The University of Natal to train South African scholars in the analysis of social problems. The South African Institute for Race Relations was given $120,000 a year for 3 years to do fact-finding surveys on the problems of multiracial societies. Chicago and Berkeley, in collaboration with the universities of Ghana and Nigeria, were given $245,000 to spur relationships between faculty and graduate students, and so on and so forth. So here we have in the early 1950s. In the early 1950s, we have this beginning of a network of African studies programs and African studies initiatives, and again, I keep pointing out, significantly, almost exclusively with private foundation support. But all of that changed in 1958. Just to throw another date out at you. So what's happening in 1958? Well, a few months earlier, the American military had woke up one morning, trained their instruments on the heavens, and lo and behold, there it was, an object floating across the sky, unmistakably of human origin, equally unmistakably of Russian origin, Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. There was a burst of hysteria, something floating over the American skies. Maybe the Russians will stick bombs in each of them. America will have all of these little bombs floating across our sky. It was hysteria, it was panic. When the panic subsided, however, 3 questions emerged. 1, why do they have that technology and we don't? 2, why didn't we know that they had that technology? 3, if the country we spy on the most is capable of surprising us, what might be going on elsewhere? What might be going on in China, Latin America, the Middle East? So the response was immediate and massive. NDEA, the National Defense Education Act, a huge scientific and ultimately a foreign language program. NDEA, 1958, the National Defense Education Act. Like many congressional bills even today, that bill, NDEA, was loaded down with all kinds of earmarks. There was lots of fancy rhetoric, some of which was meant to blunt the sharp military edge of this bill. There was nice rhetoric about unlocking human potential, a sort of early version of No Child Left Behind. There was talk of globalization and global citizenry and so on and so forth. And this money, sort of produced science fairs all across the country. And those of you who are about my age remember when suddenly your school got science labs, and there were city science fairs, county science fairs, and there was all kinds of scholarships for people who wanted to go and enter into the scientific programs. But there was also some money given toward language and the beginning of area studies. So there's this arc from particularly in African studies, there's this arc from 4 or 5 centers funded by private foundations with a great deal of flexibility to where we are today, where we have about a dozen federally funded African studies centers that constitute this nation's greatest assemblage of African knowledge and materials. And the announcements were just made a couple of months ago for the next 4 cycles that the shining stars of African studies will be Boston University, Harvard, Yale, North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Florida, Wisconsin. Congratulations to Minnesota and Howard, Illinois, Northwestern, and Michigan State, with UPenn, Indiana, and Kansas receiving foreign language scholarships, but no center grants. But I get ahead of myself. That's one story. I said there were others, right? But first, a digression. And this digression starts with my family. As many of you know, I'm from the rural South, a farming family. But yet, many of my family members were able to go to colleges. They went to places like Fort Valley State, places like Tuskegee, places like Tougaloo, places like Morehouse. And when I told them about my fancy new job at this old center that was established in 1953, they began to question me on that date. They said, we went to college, and it was before 1953, and we studied Africa. And I said, but you know, you didn't really have programs, African studies programs. They said, but we had actual Africans who were teaching us about Africa. And I said, but you know, they really weren't programs, a little less confident this time around. It became clear to me that that story was nested within a larger story. And this is a story that says the systematic study of Africa in the United States was started and sustained by African Americans. From the end of the Civil War, African Americans began to travel extensively and write vibrantly about Africa. In some cases, they were actually re-engaging with family members. If we take the case of Liberia, there are many American families who still remember which parts of their family decided to go and which parts of their family decided to stay. My own experience, a little boy in church, I can remember our pastor on Sundays reading the newsletter from our soul missionary in Liberia. And every month we'd hear these stories about what was going on in Liberia. Did the rains come? Are the crops okay? And every year our little missionary from Liberia would bring some Liberians to our little church. And I remember our families would fight to see who would be able to bring them home for Sunday dinner. So there were these connections. But anyhow, after the Civil War, African Americans traveled all over Africa and wrote about their experience. There's an interesting book out recently, 2003, James Fairhead, Melissa Leach, entitled African American Explorations in West Africa, 19th Century Diaries. But this volume barely scratches the surface. There was a virtual cottage industry of African Americans writing about Africa after the Civil War. Now, clearly this was targeted to a popular rather than a scholarly audience. But I remind you, 1860s, 1870s, we are decades away from the formal beginnings of my discipline, under France Boas at Columbia University, and then it would be another 50 years before that before anything called African history would show up in the academy. So clearly these early writings were not framed by the paradigms and the perspectives or carried out using the methodologies that would be deemed acceptable in the academy today. But they do provide a breadth and a depth of material, an intimate look at day-to-day life in Africa that I would suggest still warrant examination today. 1890. The second moral act. Those of you who are at land-grant institutions know what I'm referring to. Because there was a first Morrill Act passed in 1862, and this was the bit of legislation that formed this giant network of land-grant colleges all across this country. But it was a very segregated act. And so Congress corrected that 30 years later with the second Morrill Act in 1890, funding, bringing into being a network of historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs. And in addition to offering practical training, that was the main purpose of these institutions, mostly their main purpose, historically black colleges, to offer practical training. But these HBCUs also assumed the role of upliftment. And I invite you to go back in history and look at upliftment as a philosophical term. Look it up. Upliftment in the broader sense. Most of these universities develop courses in Negro life, or the Negro in world history, which invariably contains substantial Africa content. Second digression. Reflections on the Negro. Today, that's the other N-word, especially among us African Americans. Negro, please. I mean, there can be no harder slam. Negro. But what did it mean 100 years ago? What did it mean when the HBCUs were coming online and developing courses about the Negro? One of the easy ways of turning back the clock is to go back and look at some of the publications of that era. And one that I'm going to point you in the direction of is the journal that was founded by Carter G. Woodson, the Journal of Negro History, the very first edition, which came out in 1916. What are on the pages? Just look at the index. What are on the pages of that very first edition? Let me tell you. There's one story about the Negroes of Cincinnati prior to the Civil War. There's another story on a Negro family that was chased out of Virginia for being too uppity and who relocated and prospered in Detroit. There was another story about early churches among our Negro brethren in Jamaica and Haiti. There was another story about the ancient Negro, titled The Ancient Negro Wisdom of Africa, which was essentially an analysis of Akan folktales and proverbs. There was another story about the Negro Kingdom of Ethiopia. There was another story about Antar, the Negro poet and warrior of ancient Arabia. Negro was a very Pan-African term. Much of early African studies is hidden under Negro stuff. Most HBCUs also founded churches, many of whom took seriously their mission mandate, dispatching Black Baptists, Black Methodists to the African continent, while also hosting a steady flow of young African students to this side of the Atlantic. HBCUs helped in the establishment of many new African universities and offered hands-on technical expertise in agricultural and mechanical sciences, agriculture, A&M. Just think about how many of the HBCUs are A&Ms. The agricultural and the dynamic interaction between continental Africans and African Americans from the late 19th century onward was immense. During the interim, Du Bois worked for the NAACP journal, The Crisis, as you all remember, and he spent a lot of time organizing the Pan-African conferences of 1919, 1921, 1923, 1927, 1945 that were respectively held in London, Paris, Brussels, Lisbon, and New York. These early conferences stand as testimony to the degree to which continental Africans and African Americans at that time saw their global destinies as inextricably linked, in fact, one destiny. And so this second tale says W.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, Lorenzo Turner, William Leo Hansberry, John Cromwell, Sinclair Drake are the founders of African studies. Not Herskovitz, not Northwestern. Stories. So on the one hand, we have a story that's more referring to formal programs developed 50, 60 years ago in a Cold War context. They have African studies in their name, though few of them are departments. And on the other hand, we have a popular tradition, given some impetus by the development of HBCUs, courses, faculty, student exchanges with Africa, missionary work, research initiative, and applied development projects. Two stories, two rivers. Episode 2, the early challenges of each of these streams. The first story, remember, was coming on board in the 1950s. This, again, the elders here will remember something called the Red Scare. You remember? McCarthy. There's a communist under every rock. They're coming to get us. We must ferret out the communists everywhere. Senator Joseph McCarthy. His favorite enemies were Hollywood folks. Clearly they're communists. They're immoral. They're godless. They're having way too much fun. They've got to be communists. Unions. Organizing the masses for the common good. Communists. Got to be communists. But his other targets were educators and professors. I'm not sure why, but I think it was anyone that showed any interest, too much interest in foreign stuff. Were suspicious. He was simply suspicious of people interested in foreign things. Hence, when the NDA comes online, the National Defense Education Act in 1958, there's enough of a consensus, enough bipartisan support in Congress to pass the bill, but yet there's still those who are suspicious of these professor types. So what do? They institute a loyalty oath. If you wanted federal funds to study language and culture, you had to pledge your loyalty to the United States. Some institutions, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and others, rejected this round of funding outright, declaring that it is offensive to prevailing notions of academic freedom. Interestingly, students on those very same campuses pushed back, asserting that the university stance was an abridgment of their freedom to decide to sign a loyalty oath in exchange for funding. Anyhow, to move the story forward quickly, John F. Kennedy came in, he rescinded the loyalty oath, pulled the program out of the Defense Department and moved it into what was then HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare. Nixon came in and tried to cut the program, and so it has gone back and forth. But it's not as neat and clear as Republicans come in and cut and Democrats come in and restore. But it is clear that the budget sort of goes up and down in tandem with the shifting political and budgetary trends in Washington. So the problems with this first story is, one, the budgetary uncertainty, period. Two, remember the diversity I talked about in those early days, in the 1950s, when foundations were supporting African studies. Once African studies became tethered to federal funds, this nice 4-year chunk of money, African studies programs began to increasingly sculpted to meet federal requirements. If any of you have ever worked on a Title VI proposal, you know it's got 11 little categories, and you get so many points for this, and so many points for that, and so many points for teacher training, and so many points for that. So all of the programs, all of our major programs now have sort of converged on a particular unified style. In some senses, African studies has become a game of chasing points. But we poor sinners are sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, it's a nice, solid chunk of money, but it requires you to sculpt and grow your program in tandem with the wishes of a schizophrenic Congress, that one year thinks African studies ought to be doing this, and next year they think African studies ought to be doing that. On the other part of that rock and that hard place is, of course, your own deans and provosts that are saying, whatever you do, don't lose the money. What were the early challenges of that second stream? For them, it's simply been an ongoing battle for recognition and respect. Let's go back to the 1950s again, okay? You've got the U.S. government that realizes that it has an urgent need for hundreds and hundreds of new civil servants, diplomats, embassy staff, policy analysts with the highest levels of knowledge about Africa and experience in Africa. We're going to have a veritable flood of African leaders and diplomats and functionaries that are going to descend on the UN in New York. and joined the diplomatic community in Washington, D.C. This is the context. Picture that. Digression number 3. I had an uncle, worked for the State Department back in those days. Probably the lowest level of functionary that exists. But in this new context, suddenly all of these new folks are going to come to Washington, D.C., these early Africans. And again, those of you who are old enough to remember that time period, I mean, picture that group coming, the Nkrumahs of the world, the Nyeris, the Kaundas descending on the United States. These were not only people who were intent upon forging new African philosophies, new forms of governance, new economic systems, but these were also people who were trying to develop new Africans, new aesthetics, new forms of presentations. They descended on Washington with the big agbadas, giant colorful birds, and a city full of dark suits. They were fearful and intimidating. The dark suits didn't know what to do. What do we do with them? Where do we take them? How do we feed them? What do we feed them? And this is particularly in a town, Washington, D.C., which, if you remember, in the 1960s was still a very segregated town. So my lowly uncle was suddenly converted into some sort of protocol officer and told, you figure it out. You take them. You meet them at the airport. You figure out what to do with them. So as a kid, I remember visiting Washington, D.C. and going to his house, and it would just be a whirl of giant and colorful cloth, these larger-than-life figures. And there'd be professors there. There'd be professors from Howard and from Morgan State and from Bowie State. Because remember, some of these folks actually studied in the United States, and while they were here, they had to live the segregated black life. Many of them were they were very comfortable in African American settings, and many of them were happy to re-engage with friends. So, for Assistant Secretary of State McGee to say, we have no expertise. There's no programs available. We need to develop a set of African studies programs from scratch in places like Evanston, Bloomington, Champaign-Urbana, Madison, East Lansing. For African Americans, this was an oversight too obvious to be the consequence of simple ignorance. In the racial climate of the late 50s, early 60s, this was a slap in the face. This is evidence that the U.S. government was fearful of placing its diplomatic fate in the hands of its African American citizens, though it didn't mind if African Americans took the lead in the caring and the feeding of Africans. Episode 3. Moment of convergence and rupture. Picture, if you will, someone standing at this very podium. Someone not quite like me, though. And they're reading. The African Studies Association is a non-profit organization of scholars and professionals with an interest in the continent of Africa. It was started in New York City in 1957. It is the leading organization of African studies in North America. Its principal focus is on promoting research and scholarly production. The ASA holds annual conferences where, in addition to the presentation of hundreds of scholarly papers, awards are given for Best Scholarly Book, Best Children's Book, Best Africana Bibliography, and to Distinguished Africanist for lifetime contribution to the field. It is an organization that seeks to stay free of party politics and political dogma, where members of all political and disciplinary persuasion can meet to engage in free and open scholarly discourse. Welcome to the 12th annual meeting of the ASA, Montreal, 1969. Is that cryptic enough for you young folks? Ask them about it. Ask your elders about it. Now picture someone kind of like me, in a sort of a Kanye-esque type mold, rushes on stage, grabs the microphone, and begins to read. The African Studies Association is an undemocratic organization that maintains a two-tier membership structure. that facilitates the perpetuation of a predominantly white male board of directors and allows for no significant African American participation in the governance of the organization. 2, the board acts as gatekeepers, exercising undue influence on who gets scholarships, who gets research funding, which topics on Africa receive attention, which curricular initiatives get enacted. 3, the ASA refuses to acknowledge that the rightful subject of African studies is not just the so-called sub-Saharan Africa, or nor even the entirety of the continent. The study of Africa cannot be delinked from the study of African Americans and the African diaspora worldwide. That was 35, 45 years ago. Is any of this really relevant today? Why open up old wounds? Clearly, ASA has moved on. Indeed, if we look at the leadership structure now, President Judy Byfield handed the torch to Eiley Tripp, handed it to Abdi Samatar, who handed it to me. I just handed it to Toyin Falola, who will hand it to Dorothy. We are clearly no longer a bastion of white male power. Indeed, in some of our recent conversations, we've talked about the need perhaps for some affirmative action for white males to address what is clearly a current imbalance. But 30 years ago, a generation of African Americans did indeed grow up with the notion that ASA was theirs. Anything called African studies is theirs. We have African American studies, African American and African studies, black studies, diaspora studies, black world studies, Africana studies, ethnic studies. We can meaningfully study Africa under any of those rubrics. And I bring this up because the legacy still remains. On many of our campuses, there's still something called African studies over here, and there's something else over there called black studies, Africana studies, so on and so forth. Digression number 4. 2009, I had the honor of being hired by Michigan State University. Go Green. I was asked to direct their African Studies program, and yet on the other side of the campus was something called the African American African Studies program. In those days, this is before Kiki took over and changed everything, but in those days, those graduate students, again, were mostly African Americans. They hardly any of them showed up at African Studies Center public programming, or applied for FLAS programs to study African language, or participate meaningfully in the organization of our annual Africanist Graduate Conference. I took the liberty of inviting all of the students in the African American and African Studies program to lunch. Free food resulted in some of them showing up, about 14 in fact, and somewhere over the course of lunch I asked them about their research topics, and it turned out that 12 of the 14 were doing topics directly related to Africa. And yet, they had not been conditioned to think of the African Studies Center as their center, their font of resources to be tapped. That was where those people did their stuff about Africa to Africa. There was a complete gap on our college campuses, and I would suspect that some of your own campuses have some of those same dynamics still being played out from that 30-year-ago period. Many of you are aware that there's something called the National Council for Black Studies. They are in fact having their 40th anniversary in their very next meeting. They have about 500 presentations, 500 papers every year as well. I took the liberty of perusing last year's program, and just by rough estimate, I would say at least a quarter of their papers would fit right nicely within our conference. And if you happen to be one of those people that thought that African Americans are Africans, all of their papers fit here. Episode 4. Current challenges and perspectives. I know this is where most people thought it would start. Challenges and perspectives. From that first story, 9/11 still reigns as a significant moment. In some ways, an even more deadly moment for us than the Sputnik moment. The same questions emerged after 9/11. Why didn't we know? What else don't we know? Except this time around, there was someone to blame. Area studies. Now, and of course, Middle Eastern studies in particular. It's not as if, Congress, our government expected that somehow Middle Eastern studies would say, those guys want to get in that plane and blow up that building. But some of the conversations suggested they did expect that why didn't our Middle East experts tell us about the depth of the hatred? Why didn't they tell us that that hatred had taken institutional form? Why didn't they tell us that that institutional form had significant financial backing as to be a serious threat to the country? And the answer floating around Washington was, and this is just bringing up old rhetoric again, but because our area studies are filled with these tenured radicals who love studying Arabic literature and poetry and architecture and ancient civilizations and religion and gender dynamics and music and performative practice, nothing that helps national security. In fact, these Title VI programs tend to turn out the kind of students who love the country that they're studying more than the country that's actually funding them. Again, we get this sort of suspicion of the professorate that parallels the McCarthy era. The kid gloves came off after 9/11. All that noble talk about the need for global citizenry evaporated. It's clear. We were told Title VI not serving our purpose, and that purpose is to be an effective pipeline to intelligence and national security. The call came out, eliminate all African studies programs. Shortly after that, it became time for the reauthorization. As many of you know, all federal legislation has to be reauthorized every decade or so. And so at the next reauthorization, there was a war. Generally, these reauthorizations take, one session of Congress, a few weeks of talk, and then, they tamper with it. This reauthorization took 6 years. Those of you who are behind the scenes don't remember. It took 6 years of battling in Congress with lots of people saying, completely eliminated. And even the moderates were those who said, let it survive, but let's set up review panels. And those of you who write Title VI proposals, or review panels. They wanted to review all of our curricula to weed out left-leaning courses and the associated left-leaning professors. These were serious discussions. We had to really battle. There was talk of pledges of diversity of curriculum. There was even talk of pledges of loyalty, once again. We fought back. We survived. But the landscape ended up changing significantly. An array of parallel programs popped up, all directly under the control of the military. Some of you know the names, the Boren Bill, the National Security Education Program, and a whole array of programs. The one that sort of gets me the most is the Defense Language Institute. This was sort of our government's premier institution for training military, civil service, government officials, whoever. The Defense Language Institute. Its budget before, I don't know, it's a little, right before lunch and everything to throw numbers out, but try and picture this. $77 million was their annual budget before 9/11. $77 million, and that's an awful lot of money for one institution teaching foreign language and culture. Today, their budget is $345 million. Okay? 77, 345 million. Title VI, not just one, the entire array, the entire 120 plus centers that represents America's major thrust in international learning. Our entire budget before 9/11 was 126 million. Now it's down to 77. So 120 centers get 77. One center, government control, gets 345 million. I don't know how. All of our Title VI centers together get 1/5 the amount of money of one institution under government military control. We've also seen the emergence, some of you have seen on your campus, SCRAT, S-C-R-A-T, the Social Cultural Research Advisory Teams. This is a team that hires, this is a military team, it hires PhDs with language skills to be embedded in American military engagements around the world. HTT, the Human Terrain Team, again, another military operation that hires PhDs with language training. Born has now magnified into an array of programs. The Minerva Institute, a robust grant to support scholars studying strategic hotspots and find out the underlying causes. In other words, I mean, for those of you who think that our funding, our lack of funding is because, well, the government doesn't, you know, we need to lobby, we need to mobilize, we need to convince the government that they need to spend more money on language and culture. They don't need to be convinced. The spending is at an unprecedented level. But it's all going to the military. The three-legged stool that used to constitute the support for area studies, for African studies, you know, global citizenry, promote global citizenry, business competitiveness, military might, has collapsed. The American citizenry doesn't want to be globalized. They're afraid. They've been conditioned to be afraid of the world and anything that comes from the world. Business competitive, businesses have realized we don't need to support training Americans in language and cultures. We can just simply relocate wherever in the world is cheapest to produce, and we get the best tax rate. And the military, as I've just said, has produced their own configuration. Four, I'm going to have to be brief here as I've been told. What are the current challenges? I should finish up there. Finish up that point. It's time for reauthorization again. And we have a new Congress. So if we're looking at that first story, we see quite a bit of challenges. It's going to be rough for African studies. There are those who clearly are declaring African studies is going to die. But yet, I've been fortunate enough to hang out, to even formally review all of those programs, and I find provocative new scholarship emerging, stuff on identity, authenticity, agency in the African diaspora. I see more students than ever being attracted to African studies, and interestingly, I see more of what were centers and programs actually being upgraded to full departmental status. And these are not, again, named African Studies departments. They're, again, named African American, Afrikaner, diaspora, and global studies. I see sort of a spark of energy in that particular area. And again, surprised every time I pick up the Chronicle, there's some new ethnic unit at some university that's somehow hiring. So in those areas, in that world, I don't see people bemoaning the marginalization of Africa. Indeed, in that world, it's kind of a silly question. You know, those who find Africa, marginalized. I mean, if you entered African studies as a Cold War exercise, yeah, you're kind of marginalized right now. If you got into African studies because you were interested in experimenting with new development paradigms, well, yeah, you're kind of marginalized at this moment in history. Or if you just gravitated toward Africa because it's sort of it's a quaint curiosity, a place to get back to nature. Yeah, these aren't good times with all the AIDS, the orphans, the Ebola, the blood splattering around. Not a good place to be cooling out. But for those who started and sustained African studies, African Americans, how could Africa ever be marginalized? No more possibly being marginalized in America being marginalized in mainstream academy. There are those who go as far as to say, yeah, African studies is simply coming back home to the place where it resided before Africanists took it over. Now, and I'm going to ask for another 5 I'm going to ask for another 10 minutes. Excuse me. Because I need to explain, because I know that from many perspectives, my little narrative sounds like it's a needless exaggeration, a crude caricature, maybe even a pointless rendition, certainly vastly oversimplified history. But, you know, and I do apologize for that. One, they didn't give me much time. So there's not much time for texture and nuance. If you're prepared to listen to me for another few hours, yeah, I can give you all the texture and the nuance. Two, and this is more importantly, I have, in fact, deliberately emphasized rupture in order to make it absolutely clear where I think bridges need to be built. And I think that the portrayal that I've given you now is not totally inconsistent with the experiences that I think many of us have on our campus where Africa is sort of fragmented. By way of epilogue, and I'm cutting out an awful lot of stuff, let me just give you 3 quick rants. One is on this issue of crisis. And here I agree with Paul Zaleza and others who think that much of this is trumped up. Much of this is kind of to keep us constantly on the defensive. I think one of the greatest impediments to us moving forward in African studies is because we spend so much of our energy trying to save African studies. Particularly those of us in leadership, we don't really have time to focus on breakthroughs in theory and method because, you know, we're always being called upon to save anthropology, save African studies. We don't have time to build the kind of institutional structures that would move us more toward the center, because there's always a panic and we have to respond to it and save African studies. We don't have time to focus as much as we should on curriculum. What would the state-of-the-art African studies curriculum look like? We don't know. We're too busy. We have to rush off and mobilize and save African studies. My suggestion is relax, produce good work, and we will survive. We know that the authorization is coming up. Suzanne and I were at a conference sponsored by the Coalition for International Education. We're already organized. We're already prepared. We know it's going to be a long, hard battle, but it will come out. In the end, we're prepared for the battle. Don't worry. Just keep doing good work. Secondly, and I think this is important, I think there's a lot of room for the African Studies Association to expand. And here, let me get back to Bowman's research. He took a lot of criticism, but the sheer scale, I think, is very important and very informative. Bowman sent out survey forms to every faculty member on every campus in the United States that was affiliated with anything called African Studies. Okay? Picture that. He found 127 things on our campuses that had African Studies in the label. 127. This is not the 200 plus African American, the 127 African Studies. And he found that only 57% of them were members of the African Studies Association. And this wasn't a guess. We actually gave him access to the African Studies Association list. And here are people who in their own campus brochures will say, yes, I'm an African Studies professor. 57%. The highest level of affiliation was by continental Africans. 77% of them were members of the African Studies Association. The lowest, African Americans. Barely 1/3 of African American professors who say, I'm an African Studies faculty, are part of the African Studies Association. So again, my major argument is about building bridges and possibility. And then my last little rant is about how the ASA should continue or needs to act as the social glue or the social engineer to bring together these multiple strands of the African Studies enterprise, including a lot that I didn't have time to touch on here today. The African Studies Association has gotten its house in order. We have an exceptional staff. Our board is exemplary. Our financial house is in order. Our books are balanced. We are well poised to serve the role of that big umbrella that brings all of these various pieces together. In fact, we're already a wonderfully interdisciplinary association. We are the big umbrella. I mean, we're a learned society in our own right, but we are an umbrella organization for 22 cognate organizations, and we have another 22 affiliated organizations with the African Studies. So we are already the nodal point for 44 different ways of thinking about Africa, 44 different ways of acting on Africa, geographical, disciplinary, thematic, Clearly, if we can welcome all of those different methods, lenses under our umbrellas, certainly we can find room for those who see Africa perhaps as see Africa through the lens of experiences of those who descended from Africa. In some ways, this meeting is symbolic of that. You note that it's hosted by a traditional African studies powerhouse, Indiana Bloomington, but it's also hosted by a traditional Africana studies program. We continue to play that role. And then the other thing that was symbolic, I think, was the presentation that took place before I came here, the live link we just had with our colleagues in Dakar. This also is the future of African studies. For decades, we've been talking about, when are we going to Africa? When are we taking ASA to Africa? The questions nowadays should be, why aren't we in continual contact with Africa? Technology can easily mediate the distance between us and Africa. So anyhow, to cut things short, the future of the African Studies Association should be increasingly more international as well as intranational. And it should be more interdisciplinary as well as more, I think, intermodal. To me, the future of African studies looks bright. Thanks very much.